with that, I think Marianna is starting off with your paper. So please, Marianna, take it away.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Kati, for coming. This is amazing. I mean, this session, we have so many different time zones, is fantastic. But so, yeah, we had with this paper, we had to the Bering and Chaki Seas, which have been undergoing warming events and alterations of biological ecosystem components over the last 20 years. And in particular, what Kati writes in this paper, we will focus on the events between 2017-2019, which appear to have distinctively disruptive of long-term physical and biological patterns. In 2018 and again in 2019, ocean temperatures were above normal in winter, and the ice extent in the Bering Sea was the lowest recorded in 4 decades. So in both years, 2018 and 19, sea ice retreated north of Bering Strait before spring. And so this early ice retreat and the lack of sea ice formation impacts, of course, phytoplankton blooms and zooplankton production, so with the repercussion throughout the food web. By understanding the responses of seabirds to broad-scale ecological shifts, then we can better predict impacts to upper trophic level taxa in a rapidly changing environment. So in the Bering Sea, recent responses of seabirds to ocean warming have included mass mortality, failed nesting attempts, and low reproductive success. So here the authors examine broad-scale responses of seabirds to a warm period, so 2017-2019, in the North Bering Sea and Chaki Sea, relative to the preceding decade, so from 2017 to 2016. So in particular, they use a vessel-based survey to assess how seabirds differed in species-specific and community-level abundance and distribution between these two time periods. So both the Bering and the Chaki Sea are characterized by different structures and can both be divided in the north and the south sub-regions. The North Bering Sea is hydrographically and biologically distinct from the southern Bering Sea, and the Chaki Sea is also structured by the Siberian current, and in the north it's also basically heavily influenced by fresh cold winter water, which is derived by the sea ice melt. In both seas basically are driven, basically the dynamics of both seas are driven by sea ice. So a large survey dataset was pulled together for this study from 2017 to 2019, and the authors compared the species richness, community composition, abundance of key species within these sub-regions between two time periods, 2007-2016 and 2017-2019. I have to say that this paper was really rich in results and context, and we could really discuss many things in so many different directions. And it has basically results at very many different levels. So we can pull out general trends, but we can also pull out species-specific responses. So we can start with the general trends. So Kati found that species richness was higher in the Bering Sea than in the Chaki Sea during both time periods. During the later period, so 2018 and 2019, the Chirkov Basin had slightly higher species richness than the North Bering Sea, and the North Chaki had also higher richness than the Southern Chaki. So in total, the annual trends in abundance indicated a general northward shift in distribution density, and total seabirds increased approximately 20% during 2017-2019, with the increase largely due to short-tail shearwaters. So here I have a first question for Kati. So with this, with these shifts in distributions, how these shifts in distributions can have implications on the individual physiology. What does it mean for the individual physiology of the species? But also, can we also expect an increase in competition?
Yeah. Those are a couple big questions, but in terms of impacts, how these changes in the North Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea, how that might be impacting physiology, was that your question, or how those interact?
We can also go on with the species, because this is also related to your species specific responses. I sort of pulled the things together, so we can also discuss your results of the species specifics. That doesn't really have to be very general.
Okay. Yeah, I think, well, these are large areas, so it's not trivial, these shifts in distribution that we're seeing. And particularly when you think of short-tailed shearwaters, they're coming up just to feed in Alaska. Of course, they breed off of Australia. They come up into the North Bering, into the Chukchi Sea by July. And they're become the most abundant bird up there, and from late July through September. So they're become an important temporary visitor. They're putting on extra, it's not new that they've been feeding the Chukchi. It's often been noted that they're abundant up there in late summer. But what we've been able to show is that there's actually been a shift in their densities and their center of distribution from Southern Bering to North Bering into the Chukchi Sea more and more, particularly the Northern Chukchi in the last 3 years, which were, as you mentioned, were the warmest on record. So they're expending more energy to go further. That must have some repercussions, I imagine, to them. It's they're already doing a 30,000 kilometer round trip, and if they're spending more time up in the north and foraging and staying there longer, then they might be having a harder time getting all the way back south to breed. So that's one aspect. The other is for the auklets, which breed in the North Bering Sea, but not in the Chukchi, at least on the east side. So they are also moving up into the Chukchi after breeding. And some of these auklets also may be coming from the Aleutian Islands. Other people have shown from tagging them. I think Alexis maybe has been tagging auklets in the Aleutians at one point, and they show up in the Chukchi, also some murrelets. So these birds are expending a lot of energy. They're going up there because with more open water, there's been longer blooms even into late summer after they've had blooms happen down in the Southern Bering. So there's a much larger biomass of copepods, other zooplankton, euphalzids. So they're up there for a reason, but it must be coming at some physiological costs. And remind me what the second part of your question.
If there is a possibility of having an increased competition in the northern part.
We haven't been, I mean, I don't know if we could show that, but certainly just the fact that the shearwaters are coming up there in such numbers, they become at least 50%, and sometimes some areas 70-80% of all the birds that we encounter on our surveys up there. So there might be some competition, probably not with the other birds so much as they might be competing with other fish that are also moving up into the Chukchi Sea, North Bering and Chukchi. One thing that happened with one of the dynamic features of the Bering Sea is the cold pool. It's a large mass of bottom water that, because of the ice that forms, and it's been a thermal barrier to large masses of pollock and cod, particularly walleye pollock. And this has been fluctuating a lot recently, especially with less ice. The cold pool border barrier moves further north. For the first time in 2018, it disappeared completely. And there was a huge influx of pollock into the North Bering Sea, and even more fish, and some fish showing up into the Chukchi Sea. So these are the ones that are probably competing with the birds more than anything for the forage fish and even for the euphalzids.
Right. So let's go back to our species-specific responses that you started to talk about. I actually have also a question about the auklets, because so you also as you just said, also we had a response in the shifts in distribution, also in the auklets, but they are actually breeding. So I was indeed but you have also sort of answered already to my question. I was actually wondering if these these differences in the shifts in distributions between the shearwaters and the auklets, it is actually because they are in a different stages. So the shearwaters are not breeding, but the auklets are actually breeding. So they are more constrained compared to the shearwater because of the location of the breeding colonies?
Yeah, definitely. There's, of course, they're very different in body type. I mean, you know, the shearwaters are made for long distance flying. They're not tied to colonies at all when they're up in Alaska. They're out there to follow the food. The auklets do breed in the North Bering Sea, and they are small bodied, meant for, you know, the small alcid, compact, high wing loading type of bodies. And so they don't fly that far, even from the colonies. Maybe the least auklet, the smallest, I think about 30 kilometers or so, and the crested maybe 50 while they're raising chicks. But in the Chukchi, they are also post-breeding. So they're already, they're not tied to the colonies when they're up there necessarily. They're going north to, and in some cases we think there's evidence that they're molting. We see them flightless and they're not able to molt. So they go up there and they hang out where there's a large biomass of copepods and euphausids, and they are there to eat, replenish the reserves before they head back south with the oncoming ice and winter. So while they're in the Chukchi, they're not necessarily tied to colonies either, but they can't fly as far perhaps, but they can dive. And so they have access to prey. And what we found in the warm years, 2017 to 19, their presence in the north shrank considerably, especially the least auklets. They never went as far as the crested auklets. They were mainly in the southern Chukchi Sea. But they, in those warm years, they remain more or less in the Chirikov Basin, near where they breed, where they did have breeding failures. And so apparently they didn't have the need to, or they didn't have the reserves to go up into the Chukchi. They didn't breed, or they failed breeding early. The crested auklets, some of them did go up into the northern Chukchi, where they normally do, out around Hana Shoal area. It's a rich area up in the north part of the Chukchi, and they so they went up there, but their area contracted. In other words, their area of their hotspot got smaller, and their numbers got smaller. So what we saw in the Chirikov in the warm years, that's the Chirikov Basin is the northern part of the North Bering Sea, just south of the Bering Strait. Their numbers shot up there. They were hanging out there where they normally would have moved into the Chukchi during the post-breeding period. So in the meantime, the shearwater is not tied at all to colonies, and we're following the prey and considerably northward of where they were normally hanging out.
Exactly. So I really found really fascinated that so we had so many different type of responses. So we got the shearwaters that shifted basically northwards. Then we got the auklets and black-legged kittiwakes that also increased slightly, but also the distribution shrinked and also was a little bit moved northwards. But then we got both more species that instead declined. So a third type of response for these species. So I was related really to this to the spatial contraction of the MERS. I was wondering if for example you have any tracking data that could actually also show how this failure basically is happening, because you were also talking about starvation, and that you will find like that you could see from the carcasses of the individuals signs of starvation.
Yeah, since about the seabird die-offs have been very rare up there in the north in the past. Starting in 2015, it's been almost an annual occurrence. So if you recall from one of the figures in my paper, it has a long, and I do want to acknowledge, by the way, that my two co-authors on here, I think, Dan Cushing and Liz Zabunski, and they did a lot of this work too. So the long-term trend, if you look annually at these long-term trends, the declines actually started around 2013 to 2015, depending on the species and the region and which region you look at. So it's not like things just suddenly changed during the last 3 warm years. This has been ongoing. And I should point out also that with the short-tailed shearwaters, we talked about how their numbers have gone down in the south. The 2019 was the year that we had this, one of the largest recorded die-offs of shearwaters in the Bering Sea. It was occurred in the South Bering Sea. But nonetheless, that is another example of where there appears to be some food-related problems for many types of species, not just planktivores, not just piscivores. So going back to the thick-billed murre contraction, and then when we did a cluster analysis that found in this particular area, in our study of the area during these years, 5 major communities. 4 of them, and we named them after the lead species in those, except for the last one, which is the low density community, and it had no dominant species and extremely low densities of total birds. That was one of the 2 groups. The shearwaters expanded their range and their extent, and the low density community did. And that was mainly from the east side, both in the North Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. So we had an expansion of a very low density area of birds while the other communities shrunk. And the thick-billed murres actually increased up in the North Bering Sea relative to the South Bering, they increased in the Chukchi relative to the Northern Bering Sea. But it was in the Northern Bering Sea where they did have a die-off in 2018, a really large one, in addition to reproductive failure. And I think Alexis will be talking more specifically about that. We don't have any tracking data. I don't. I think others, Alexis, did you guys track during that period? Did you have tags on birds?
So we tried, but we ended up only having tracks from 2016, and our sample size was super small for both murre species.
And some of the Japanese scientists did some tracking as well, but I don't think they had enough certainly there was not long-term data that you could compare like they've done, for instance, at Middleton Island, where they have enough birds tracked over a longer period where they could actually see changes between years that they could associate it with prey distribution.
Right. So I have more questions, but if David and Grant want to ask some questions, or we can ask also the audience, I'm happy to step down for a little bit.
David, how about you? You go first.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kathy. So good to see you, and congratulations on your work. I'm missing the Arctic meetings this year, even though that's really good for my carbon footprint. So thanks for your study. And I was wondering if you could compare with the situation in the North Atlantic, because what you speak about also in terms of the consequences and the large seabird die-offs seem really severe. And I was wondering, why, on this side of the world, we don't have events which are as catastrophic. I know that climate change, is much more, the warming effect is much more marked, for instance, in the Beaufort Sea and in the Chukchi Sea. But I was wondering whether there were other factors which were contributing to the fact that, these seabird die-offs were very marked in the Bering Sea, the Northern Pacific.
It's hard to say. Certainly, the Bering Sea and the Chukchi are both the ecosystem has been so tied to the sea ice extent. And I think that has probably been even more so than over in the Atlantic.
Yeah,
The
I
changes that
was
we've-
thinking of that. Yeah, I was thinking of that because if you look at the North Atlantic, you know, the part which is really warming a lot at the moment is southwest of Greenland, where it's not as dominated. Sorry, southeast of Greenland, where it's not as sea ice dominated as, you know, the ecosystem we're talking about today.
Yeah, yeah, with the ice, the retreat of the, well, for one thing, the ice, just the retreat of the ice, you know, allowing the photosynthesis to occur earlier and such. But the ice algae that forms under the ice in the spring has a lot to do with feeding the zooplankton and then the fish. So all that is changing when there's no ice at all. For one thing, is a big change. And then because of that, with the cold pool disappearing periodically now, or fluctuating and disappearing in 2018, we know there's been a large movement of fish up northward. And that, I think, is, as I mentioned earlier, I think is a big impact. And I don't know if there's anything comparable to that. And I know there's been shift in some of the fish stocks in the Atlantic, but I don't think there's been that kind of a major shift of ecosystem components. I could be wrong about that, but
yeah, there was a lot going on around Shetland. There were situations which, you know, could be compared to what you're observing.
Yeah.
But
And
in
then
recent years, yeah.
Very large biomass of zooplankton in the Chukchi now, and a much longer ice-free period. There's just birds are hanging up there much longer. In addition, there's marine mammals moving up, whales mainly, that are increasing northward, and certainly those are competitors in some sense.
Yeah.
In some cases, they might be beneficial because for, you know, the gray whales, when they move up there and churn up the ocean, you always see the shearwaters gathered around them because they're feeding off the stuff that's brought to the surface. So it's not all negative, perhaps, for some species.
Yeah, and I was thinking also a strength of your work is that you know, you're looking back at a very long time series of these at-sea observations. That's I think really a strength of your work, and I was wondering whether now you could look at these processes at the scale of decades, maybe, because, you know, there were changes also in the past. I was wondering whether, you know, these very recent years, how they compare to processes at more a decadal scale?
Yeah, as you might be aware, we worked with Adrian Gall, who published a paper, I think in 2019 it came out, but it looked at up in the Chukchi offshore, how the species composition has changed from primarily fish-eating birds to from 1970s to 2000 or so, 2007, I think, over to more planktivores. This is offshore, not at the colonies, but offshore. And one of our questions is that now going to change back to more fish-eating birds again? And that's something we want to look at going into the future, we hope. And one reason is that people that are looking at when we go on these research cruises, there's other people looking at oceanographics and zooplankton and fish. And some of their questions have to do with that change. Like at some point, is it going to become more of a pelagic system, less of a benthic system, which it is now up there? And so how will that affect the birds as well? I think, well, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's certainly something we want to look at in the long term. Well, there's predictions as to what's going to go on in terms of the zooplankton productivity, and it's not just the abundance of the zooplankton, for instance, but the type of zooplankton have changed. And during the warm years, you'd get the smaller, low energy density species. and fewer of the larger copepods that are energy rich, and a decrease in the value of the fish. The Arctic cod, which is up there now, is fairly high energy dense, but the walleye pollock moving up, which might overtake it as the water warms, is much lower quality prey. So that will influence or impact the fish-eating birds as well.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. That sounds very familiar as a process also compared to the North Atlantic. Yeah, thanks a lot. Grant, do you have any questions or maybe questions from the forum?
Yeah, I just have one little question here, Kathy. The just out of curiosity, how much niche overlap is there between these species? I mean, with short tails moving into the Chukchi, I mean, presumably these are mega flocks that are showing up there now. Is there any indication that these mega flocks are actually pushing out other species like murre and competing for prey?
It's certainly something I've wondered about. And do keep in mind that this isn't new that the shearwaters are up there. I mean, I think George DeVoker reported on this, seeing them up there in the 80s, 70s or 80s. But there are more of them up there for longer now. And one interesting thing, I think, if you look at in my paper, I'd note in the last 3 years, the very warm years, the areas that did not decrease, where there was more of an aggregation of birds, were sites that were already recognized as hotspots, so to speak, along the Anadir Current west of St. Lawrence Island, and around Hannah Shoal area, which is the shallow area up in the northern Chukchi, and Barrow Canyon, the deep canyon that runs from the Arctic Ocean up, runs southwest up into the Chukchi Sea, a very rich area. So the birds were still high density in those areas, they perhaps more concentrated in these hotspots. So that might be where competition might start. We might still, I think if you want to look for competition, those would be the spots to look, particularly like Barrow Canyon. Whether or not, when the shearwaters certainly aggregate around there, the area is big enough, it's not visually obvious that there's competition happening. But if prey becomes limiting and more concentrated, certainly those mega flocks of shearwaters might be an issue, might be something to consider.
Cool. All right, thanks, Kathy. Is there any questions from anybody in the audience today? I don't see anybody desperately raising their hands, but please do, if you have a question, just pop your hand up. And in lieu of that, Marianna, if you've got any more questions for Kathy, we can pass it back to you.
I think we can also move on, because I have also some questions actually for both Kathy and Alexis. So the two papers are really combine very well together. So we can move on. Yeah. Okay,
let's do that then. We'll move on to Alexis's paper. Thanks for that, Kathy, and we'll I'm sure we'll be bugging you again very shortly.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kathy. It was very kind of you to stay up late to be with us. Thanks so much.
I'll go to my wine now.
do bring one over here. Doesn't matter. It's 8:30 in the morning. It's fine.
I should have put Bailey's in my coffee this morning. Alexis, how are you? I'll get you to unmute yourself.
I'm doing good.
Good. You're in Alaska too, hey?
Yeah, same time zone as Kathy.
Awesome.
Brave also. Yes. Thanks for being with us. And so the papers are part of a special edition of Deep Sea Research. So it's part of a group of an even larger group of papers. And that's very interesting. And the second we picked today, you are leading, Alexis, and this is where we learn that sea ice loss in the Pacific Arctic does not benefit piscivores and is detrimental to planktivores. So you're leading a large consortium of researchers from Japan and the US, and you're affiliated to the National Institute of Polar Research in Japan. I'm really happy to speak about the Bering Sea today. It's kind of a mythic place to me, and I barely know. And I love to speak about it, not only because of its incredible geological, ecological, and human history, but also, of course, because it's a seabird hotspot in terms of biomass and of species diversity. For us Europeans, in particular, the diversity of alcids sounds like a dream. And the region is also, in the region, there's also a very fine community of seabird researchers. And one thing they investigate, of course, are the consequences of global warming. And in this context, a strong hypothesis in the Bering Sea is that as sea ice disappears, there will be an influx of warm water with an invasion of pelagic fish, especially from lower latitudes. That's what we just discussed with Kathy. And that will occur to the detriment of the Arctic zooplankton community. In the North Atlantic, this phenomenon is called Atlantification. So let's see if there's also a pacification in the Bering Sea. Alexis and her colleagues studied piscivorous seabirds, common and thick-billed murres, black-legged kittiwakes, and planktivorous species, least and crested auklet on St. Lawrence Island. The idea was that piscivorous species would benefit from pacification, while planktivorous species would get all stressed by the warming event. And the research team used a vast array of techniques, remote sensing to have an idea of sea ice cover and sea surface temperatures, ship-based surveys to assess seabird food resources, GPS tracking to define the at-sea home ranges, stable isotopic analysis on seabird blood on their prey, and finally, but very importantly, corticosterone dosages to assess seabird stress level. So a very impressive armada of techniques they used across 4 breeding seasons with exceptionally low sea ice years in 2018 and 2019. At the end of the day, they found that the northern Bering Sea ecosystem did not shift to a pelagic dominated system yet when sea ice was scarce, so it apparently did not pacify. Yet decreased sea ice in late winter was associated with increased nutritional stress in all 5 seabird species. In common murres and black-legged kittiwakes, this stress was linked with declining forage fish abundance as measured in bottom and surface trawl surveys. And also both planktivorous auklets experience high nutritional stress during years with warmer August sea surface temperature. So global warming was so far bad news for everyone in this system. And I found really interesting how you put everything together to get that perspective. And it's certainly very complementary to other papers in this special issue of deep sea research. Looking at all this and also at the nice maps in your publication, I was trying to figure exactly how this was complementary to the work Kathy has done and the stuff we just discussed, because what Kathy investigated is slightly further north with respect to your study zone. And so how does it work? Are you actually on the southern margin of a seabird hotspot? And I was wondering how this geographic position of the seabird on St. Lawrence Island had an impact or what it could tell us about the general processes in the region. I wondered whether you could elaborate on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, as Kathy was talking or answering questions, a lot of her findings reflect things that are either in this paper or that we found for birds. We also had a strong non-breeding component to our research, which the publications are kind of trickling out on that. But a lot of what she was talking, we've seen at a much more localized scale about where birds are going and about what the repercussions are of where they're, how long they're staying in certain areas. So with the way that the Northern Bering Sea and the Southern Chukchi Sea are set up, there's 3 major currents that sort of funnel into the Bering Strait. And so our work is really reflective of what's happening sort of in the Anadyr current. So the cold, really nutrient-rich current that's coming up into the region. So one thing that we're kind of missing with the changes that we see are what might be happening to the seabird colonies that are on the Alaska coast, because those might be more influenced by the Alaskan coastal current, whereas Kathy's work really gets the whole picture, right? So she has, all the current systems are covered in her survey region. So when she's talking about things that are happening in the Chirikov Basin with auklets and with thick-billed murres, a lot of that stuff we are able to sort of add some more detail to. But some of the other things, like there's really large kittiwake colonies on the Alaska side, some really large common murre colonies. So those species might be having some different responses depending on where their colonies are located. But for the auklets, pretty much what she's seeing and what we're seeing are highly complementary in terms of where they're going, changes in distribution and things like that.
Yeah, and I think also through the discussions today, we see, really that it's a complex system with also many subsystems. Because once more, I'm not really familiar with this part of the world, but every time I see regional studies, the messages they convey, can be very different. And so a lot of complexity in this system, and hence an interest for getting a full picture of the processes.
Right, and we saw that even in some of our stuff looking. So we ended up having to break our looking at the fish surveys, the prey at sort of both the local level where the birds were actually foraging, but then because there's so much work that's done at a more regional level, we also had to look and see how that compared to what might be found at the more regional level. And sometimes those patterns change depending on, where you are looking in the region. So just like you're saying that it's, a little bit of a mosaic at times up there.
Yeah, and especially because I saw on the map, so the fish surveys you had were actually on a much larger spatial scale than the seabird tracking. So am I right in thinking that you had partial overlap between your seabird home ranges and the fish surveys, but then the fish surveys actually provided information about a much wider area?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the seabirds actually on St. Lawrence seem to forage relatively close to the colony.
Yeah, I found this tracking on the maps, yes.
Yeah, and so really the overlap, if we were to just restrict the stations that overlapped with the seabirds, it'd be like maybe 2 stations at best. So yeah, so we kind of had to do a little bit of a wider view to see what the patterns were between years.
And well, I think it's great. It's so rare in seabird studies to have a parallel surveys of the fish base. So, but these fish surveys, were they especially designed and conducted with respect to your work, or were they ongoing anyways?
No, so we got really lucky. Well, we are lucky that there is so much interest in general in the Bering Sea. So the NOAA does extensive fish surveys, and so we teamed up with what they had already done and just combined, brought their data set in to look at how that matched up with our work. So it's totally independently designed, and is much more aimed at tracking fish of commercial interest, which unfortunately on our side of things is never capelin or forage size fishes. So good thing, I guess, they're not harvested, but at the same time, when they are looked at in surveys, it's sort of secondary. So I think in our methods, you'll see, the mesh size of the nets that they're using aren't designed to catch forage fish. So there could be some underrepresentation of their actual numbers.
Well, you're very lucky. You're very lucky with that. That fisheries are not going for these fish to do fish meal with them. So I think you can be lucky with that. And so I'm really interested in St. Lawrence Island and the Alcid community there, especially because you have a few little hawks or doveckies actually present there, which I think is incredible. But I saw in the paper that the sample sizes for the GPS tracking you did were relatively small. So I was wondering whether this was due to the birds, being particularly difficult to study at that location.
Yeah, so we've just in general tracking seabirds on St. Lawrence Island has proved to be quite a struggle. So part of it is that crested auklets are really on the small end of what can carry GPS tags, and they're really sensitive. And so we tried sort of a small set of birds with ecotone GPS units to download via VHF. But that kind of meant we could only have like 1 or 2 nests because they're nesting in these rocky crevices, these rock taluses. So they're not really transmitting the data back to a base station unless we have the base station like shoved into the nest. And then also they were pretty susceptible to abandonment. So we had a hard time, with the birds that we did tag even coming back. And anyways, so that was sort of a little bit of an issue, but there's also a really rich Siberian Yupik community that we work near, and they do a lot of seabird harvesting. And so the seabirds are very quick to learn that they're getting disturbed and alter their behavior significantly as soon as we tag them. So that was also has been an ongoing struggle in terms of retrieving tags. So we have no problem dumping all the tags out on things. It's the getting the tags back that seems to be quite the problem.
Yeah, no, I can easily understand. And was this actually the first tracking data for these species at this site, or are there other tracking projects you could draw information from to confirm the global home ranges for these species at the site?
So this is the first one at this site, but there are other studies done on it, not crested auklets, but on the Mers and kittiwakes at other at the Pribilof Islands in the southeastern Bering Sea. And so we were able to kind of compare how those home ranges lined up. But in terms of that colony, other than what's being observed by either hunters or at sea surveys where birds are during the breeding season, is kind of the only other indication we have of maybe where they are feeding. The kittiwakes, our tracks showed that they were feeding really close to shore, and that's something we saw. So, we would see our study area was covered quite a range of the coastline, and we always saw feeding frenzies, of kittiwakes just close to shore. So it seems like, even though we had a very small sample size, that was pretty representative of where the birds were going. And then talking to there's a halibut fishery that happens in the local community. So talking to fishermen about where they're seeing birds, we feel like even though our sample sizes were pretty small, we didn't just tag a fluke bird that, traveled super far or didn't travel at all. It was matching up really well with what we were also hearing from the subsistence hunters.
Okay. Yeah, Marianna, did you want to elaborate on this with your questions about the 2 papers?
Yes, I actually wanted to say that I think that Alexis' paper is a sort of adding a third dimension to Kathy's paper, because with Kathy we have this spatial the shift in the spatial distribution. Instead, with Alexis we have the isotopic niche. So we see these contractions and shifts into the distributions and behavior of seabirds from many perspectives, let's say. So I really liked it, and I was wondering if because both papers they also touch upon these sudden events, which can be like this sea ice melting, but I was also thinking about storms, and touches also on the story of the resilience of the species. So I was wondering if this is what we are going to see from let's say now on, but not really now on, but this is what we are going to see. So these sudden shifts in let's say, three dimensions, so expansions and contractions, where then the species are, like the resilience of the species is being tested.
Do you want to answer that first,
It's just
Kathy?
a comment. Yes, exactly.
Well, so that's a great question, because that's my question. So, our project is technically ended, but I'm curious whether or not what we observed is, is this just a new state? Like, is it going to just stay here? Is it going to shift back? Or are we kind of, on this march that's never to return again into something new? And so that was kind of something we had been looking at with our paper, wondering, has it switched already or not? And what we found is that we are still at this, it's changed quite a bit and everything is getting tested, but it doesn't seem like it's made that, any big leap to something different yet. But, it's been, 1 or 2 years that these, southern predatory fishes are coming up, that there's not as much, maybe zooplankton getting transferred up, that the zooplankton production has really changed dramatically. And so, so we don't know, how long it will be before everything has to kind of reorganize. I don't know, Kathy, what your take on it is, sort of at a bigger picture scale.
Well, in terms of resilience, that's something, it was a surprise to us to suddenly have the auklets hanging out and not going up into the Chukchi as much. And that occurred when Alexis worked and others, and it showed that there had been no breeding. So whatever conditions led to the lack of breeding also affected their behavior. They were resilient in the sense that they didn't disappear, but they were more abundant in the North Bering, but they did not move up into the Chukchi. So that's one example, I think, of where they've adjusted their behavior because of conditions, and whether or not that will continue. I guess the indications that I've heard is that they did start breeding again in 2020. I think Alexis has data on that. And then going back to her observations of the colonial birds, colonially nesting birds feeding not too far from the colonies, that's evident also in the at-sea data. You can see halos of kittiwakes or murres, mainly murres and auklets near the colony areas. Particularly for murres, it's more obvious. And then the dispersal afterwards. But so it's just a reflection of the fact that they are foraging. They're limited in where they can forage, perhaps, while they're breeding. And if they fail breeding or they give up, they don't try or fail early, they're moving elsewhere where they can get some food. And that's one thing that's of interest about the thick-billed murres is the increase we saw in the Chukchi Sea. And I do want to add that the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge monitors a couple colonies up in the Chukchi, large colonies. And they actually have been seeing an increase in the number of birds there over the last 10 years or so. As colonies have decreased down in the southern Bering Sea, they've increased up in the Chukchi. And according to people who work there, they're not able to track the productivity that well, but the rate of increase is like 6 or 7% per annum the last 5 years or so. So that indicates birds are moving up there. It can't all be from productivity. It would be highly unlikely that it would be from productivity of the birds there at those colonies. So it indicates there's been immigration into the area. So we might be seeing some very slow, snail-paced changes occurring with not just birds migrating post-breeding offshore, moving further to the north, but even breeding birds perhaps generally shifting a little bit north. That's speculation at this point, but there is, from their study plots, there's indication that there's been major increases in some of the kittiwakes and murres in the Chukchi colonies, the few that are up there. But there's a limit. There's just a few spots there where they can have big cliffs where they can have these colonies, and then there's no more nesting habitat to the north. So that could be a limiting factor, at least on the east side.
Send some of those kittiwakes over here. We need them in the UK. I had a quick question about sea ice edge and whether or not there's any indication that the birds might be tracking the edge of the pack ice as that shifting over time.
What time of year are you talking about? Because there's no pack ice there, right? In the summer now for them to follow. I mean, I remember going up there and surveying along the marginal ice zone was rich with birds, but there's no ice there now.
Yeah, so that's
it's so far north. It's into the central Arctic, you know.
Yeah, and we tried. So that was one of the original goals of our project, was looking at how these 5 species were interacting with the ice in the post-breeding season. So totally off the topic of our paper, this paper, but so we had really small sample sizes, but basically it seemed like there wasn't a single species that was except maybe crested auklets that was benefiting from a prolonged ice-free time in the Chukchi Sea. So that ice edge doesn't seem to be something that they're really focusing on, except for crested auklets, or getting pushed out by or benefiting from. Yeah. So the ice edge, the productivity, it seemed to be more of what was the production was more of a factor rather than what the ice was doing. Which isn't to say, of course, that the ice isn't affecting the production, but just the physical ice itself didn't seem to be something the birds were, tracking necessarily.
I will add that I mentioned one of the hot spots was the Hanish Shoal area. It's a shallow area up in the northern Chukchi. That's also the crested auklet hotspot, gathering area, aggregation area. And that, because of its shallowness, it tends to capture whatever ice is around there. Because of the currents, it sometimes will create this island of ice up there, 100 kilometers wide or something. And so it just circulates up there for a while. Sometimes that's the last area to have ice, and that is where you do see crested auklets there, as you mentioned, and some other species. But yeah, otherwise, that marginal ice zone, maybe it still occurs in the spring. We haven't, it's not what it used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what it used to be sounds like a long time ago. We're talking 10 years.
Yeah. What it used to be. I mean, that.
Yeah. Back in the old days.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Do we have any? I don't see any questions from the audience, but please do. If anyone out there has a question, please feel free to step up. Adrian, you've turned your camera on, so you look like you have a question. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, everyone.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you all too. I'm actually hiding from Kathy because we got to talk, but I'm behind on my homework. No, I just wanted to, since it's a small group, say that there were GLS tags put out in 2005, 2006, that Lisa Guy put a couple GLS tags out. I think those were the very first ones to go out on St. Lawrence Island. And they were a bear to retrieve. And I think that the bearer of one of them may still be in my freezer, but they were not easy to put out, and they were even worse to get back. And doing it on auklets, trying to go head first way down under the rocks is, Alexis deserves a medal and then some.
Just working out there, yeah. I mean, it's not an easy place to get to, St. Lawrence Island, and let alone working, just getting back and forth there. And
I'll be forever curious to know what's going on the Diomedes, which is where I was supposed to be, but I ended up on St. Lawrence instead. Right. Just to know what's going on with the auklet populations there, and if they are, I mean, you go by and it's super duper busy.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they're more or less busy.
Do you think that there's also a lot of hunting out there?
Of auklets?
There's little Diomede still does harvest crested auklets pretty significantly. Yeah.
Okay, so the birds are likely to be jumpy out there too.
Yeah, and they're jumpy in general. Like they were jumpy to start with. So
But you don't know pre-hunting, you don't know how they were.
well, it's because
Well,
there's
you'd
some
have
other
to go back thousands of years for that.
well, yeah, but unlike, you know, other crested auklet colonies, like in the Aleutians and stuff, they are still really prone to abandon if you are messing about with them too early on.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that in terms of the Diomedes in particular, there's probably just a few areas that are accessible both to researchers and to the hunters, and most of it is not. It's rugged, steep country, and but what the community members there that I've talked to has said that the numbers are way down from what they remember in the past. So that's the local knowledge that I don't, it'd be nice to try to get a handle on, get that documented, but it's hard to say. I mean, you still see clouds of birds are there, but apparently not the clouds that they used to see.
Yeah, this tends to be the story all over.
Yeah.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, we're at 5 after 8 my time, and I think we can probably call it a morning or afternoon or evening and let you all get back to your coffee or wine or beer or whatever it is you might be knocking back at this time of day.
Right.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Alexis. It was lovely.
Thank you
to
so
see
much.
Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for the good questions. Also, Kathy, it was fun to, you know, be in on this with you together because it reminded me of all the ways that our two studies overlap so nicely.
Yeah, we need to have our own little mini conferences, Adrian and Alexis and everyone else involved.
If you do it late enough in the afternoon, you can do it over wine.
Yeah, normally we would be getting together for wine whenever we're all in town for AMS.
I want to join.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the time of day is relevant,
Doesn't
Grant.
matter, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. You take care of yourselves, and if we're not seeing you before,
Adrian, later.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Tomorrow.
you.
happy holidays.